The stench hit you before you saw the source. Walking through a medieval city meant stepping over streams of brown liquid, dodging buckets emptied from upper windows, and breathing air thick with the smell of human filth. There were no toilets, no sewers, no running water to wash it all away, yet millions lived in these conditions for centuries. So where did it all go? How did people survive in cities drowning in their own waste, and what happened when the solutions failed? Before we uncover the revolting methods of medieval waste disposal, if you're fascinated by how medieval people managed the most basic human need without modern sanitation, hit the subscribe button and give a like. Let's start with the brutal truth. Medieval people had no concept of bacteria, no understanding that waste carried disease. They knew filth smelled foul and attracted rats, but they didn't connect it to the fevers, dysentery, and plagues that swept through their communities. For most, waste disposal was a daily burden with no good solution. In peasant homes, the simplest method was the most direct. Many cottages had no dedicated toilet at all. Families used a chamber pot, a simple ceramic or wooden bowl kept in the corner of the one-room house. When full, someone carried it outside and dumped it into a midden heap, a communal pile of household refuse, animal dung, and human waste located at the edge of the property. These heaps festered for months, sometimes years, until farmers collected the rotted matter to spread on fields as fertilizer. The smell was permanent. Villages reeked of decomposition, especially in summer, when heat intensified every odor. Flies swarmed the middens, children played near them because there was nowhere else to go, and when heavy rains came, the heaps dissolved, sending streams of contaminated sludge through pathways and into wells. But rural life, for all its filth, was manageable compared to the nightmare of medieval cities. Here's where the real problem begins. Urban centers faced a waste crisis on an entirely different scale. Thousands of people crammed into walled cities with narrow streets and multi-story buildings. The mathematics was simple and horrifying. More people meant more waste, and medieval cities had no infrastructure to handle it. Most households still relied on chamber pots, but in cities there was no private land for midden heaps. Instead, residents did what seemed easiest. They threw waste out the window, literally. In many cities, a shout of warning, garderobes in Scotland or garlot in France, preceded the splash of a chamber pot's contents onto the street below. Pedestrians learned to walk quickly and stay alert, but warnings didn't always come, and even when they did, where else could people go? Streets were narrow, packed with market stalls, animals, and crowds. The waste piled up. Some cities attempted regulations. London in the 14th century required residents to keep the street in front of their homes clean, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Paris appointed street cleaners, but they couldn't keep pace with the volume. In practice, human waste mixed with animal dung, rotting food, and industrial runoff, creating a thick sludge that carpeted the streets. When it rained, the sludge turned into rivers of filth that flowed downhill, pooling in low-lying areas or draining into rivers. And those rivers, they were also the city's water supply. People drank from the same waterways where waste accumulated, bathed livestock in contaminated streams, and washed clothes in water thick with sewage. The connection between dirty water and illness remained invisible to them, but the consequences were devastating. For the wealthy, there were slightly better options, though calling them better is generous. Castles and manor houses featured garderobes, small rooms built into the castle walls with a simple wooden seat and a hole beneath. Waste dropped straight down, either into the moat surrounding the castle or into a cesspit dug below. Garderobes were private, a luxury in a world without privacy, but they came with their own problems. Moats filled with sewage became stagnant breeding grounds for disease. The smell rose back up through the garderobe shafts, making them unbearable in summer. Some castles positioned garderobes on outer walls so waste fell into rivers or open ground, but this just relocated the problem. Cesspits were worse. These were large pits dug beneath latrines, lined with stone or wood if the owner could afford it. Over time, they filled with solid waste, urine, and rainwater, creating a toxic soup that seeped into the surrounding soil. When a cesspit was full, someone had to clean it, but who would volunteer for such work? Now the most shocking detail emerges. Gong farmers were the men who emptied cesspits for a living, and theirs was one of the most dangerous, degrading jobs in medieval society. The name came from gong, an Old English word for privy or dung. These workers, also called night soil men, because they labored after dark to spare the public from the sight and smell, descended into cesspits, armed with buckets, shovels, and rags tied over their faces. The work was suffocating. Cesspits produced methane gas, and many gong farmers passed out or died from asphyxiation while working. Others drowned in the thick sludge when pits collapsed. The few who survived a career carried the stench with them permanently. Their clothes, skin, and hair absorbed it. Many were banned from entering churches or marketplaces, treated as social outcasts despite performing an essential service, yet they were paid well, relatively speaking. A gong farmer could earn more in a night than a laborer earned in a week, because no one else would do it. After extraction, the waste was carted to fields outside the city. Farmers paid for it, not because they enjoyed handling filth, but because human waste, mixed with straw and left to rot, made effective fertilizer. This created a grotesque economy, where human excrement had value. Still, the system barely functioned. Cesspits overflowed faster than gong farmers could empty them, and cities grew faster than waste infrastructure could adapt. But one particular incident revealed just how deadly the problem had become. In 1326, a tragic accident in London exposed the lethal reality of medieval sanitation. Richard the Raker, a gong farmer, fell through the rotted wooden planks covering his own cesspit and drowned in human waste. The incident was recorded in coroner's rolls. Not because it was unusual, but because it happened to occur in a wealthy neighborhood where documentation mattered. Richard's death illustrated what countless others experienced in silence. Cesspits were death traps. The wood and stone lining them decayed over time. The gases they produced were invisible killers, and the men who worked them had no safety equipment, no understanding of the dangers, just desperation for wages. Beyond individual deaths, the waste crisis contributed to larger catastrophes. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it spread with terrifying speed through cities already weakened by filth. Rats, thriving in waste-filled streets, carried fleas infected with plague. Contaminated water spread dysentery and cholera. Poor sanitation didn't cause the plague, but it created perfect conditions for disease to flourish. Yet even facing mass death, cities struggled to improve waste management because the social structure resisted change. Class divisions shaped every aspect of waste disposal. Nobles in their garderobes were isolated from the streets below. Merchants paid gong farmers to handle their cesspits, but the poor, crammed into tenements with shared courtyards, had nothing. Public latrines existed in some cities, simple structures built over rivers or pits, but they were filthy, dangerous, and overcrowded. Women avoided them at night, children fell into the pits, beggars slept nearby because no one else would. Guild regulations occasionally addressed sanitation. Tanners, whose work produced toxic waste, were sometimes forced to locate their workshops downstream from residential areas. Butchers faced fines for dumping offal in streets, but enforcement was inconsistent. Wealth bought distance from filth. The poor drowned in it, and everyone, regardless of status, breathed the same foul air, because medieval cities had no concept of zoning or public health infrastructure. But some communities attempted their own solutions. In monasteries, where discipline and routine governed daily life, waste management was more organized. Monks built latrines called revoltings, long rooms with rows of wooden seats positioned over channels of running water. Streams diverted through monastery grounds carried waste away from living quarters and into rivers beyond the walls. Some monasteries even constructed rudimentary flush systems, using rainwater collected in cisterns to periodically wash out the channels. These systems were marvels of medieval engineering, yet they remained confined to religious communities. The knowledge didn't spread to towns or villages. Why? Partly because monasteries had resources and labor that ordinary communities lacked. Partly because monks saw cleanliness as part of spiritual discipline, while lay people associated bodily functions with sin and shame. The Church's teachings about the body created a culture of silence around sanitation. People suffered privately rather than demand public solutions, and this silence had consequences that rippled through generations. Don't miss this critical point. Women faced unique sanitation challenges that male-dominated records rarely mentioned. Menstruation required constant management. Women used rags, tucked between their legs, and tied to belts, which had to be washed and reused. In crowded households with no privacy, this was difficult. In cities with contaminated water sources, it was dangerous. Pregnant women and new mothers faced additional risks. Chamber pots used during labor were emptied into streets or cesspits like any other waste. Midwives who handled birth fluids and afterbirth had to dispose of biological material with no understanding of infection. Postpartum bleeding lasted weeks, requiring more rags, more washing, more exposure to dirty water. Women's bodies produced waste that society refused to acknowledge, creating invisible suffering documented only in death records showing maternal mortality rates that climbed alongside urban squalor. Yet women also became innovators in waste management because survival demanded it. Some women collected urine for practical purposes. Urine contained ammonia, useful for cleaning wool and whitening linen. Fullers who processed cloth kept large vats of stale urine outside their workshops. Citizens, including women, contributed to these vats, creating another strange economy where bodily waste had commercial value. The practice was common enough that Roman law once taxed urine collection, and medieval cities continued the tradition. But using urine for cleaning didn't solve the larger sanitation crisis. It merely added another layer to the complicated relationship medieval people had with their own waste, a relationship defined by necessity, disgust, and economic opportunity, though few recognized the invisible dangers lurking in every contaminated well and overflowing cesspit. By the late medieval period, some cities began implementing structural changes. London constructed public conduits, channels that brought fresh water from springs outside the city, reducing reliance on polluted rivers. A few cities built covered sewers, stone tunnels that carried waste underground toward waterways. Though these systems were limited and served only wealthy districts, Paris attempted to pave streets, making them easier to clean, but the volume of waste overwhelmed any improvements. Progress was slow because medieval society lacked two critical elements. First, they had no germ theory, no scientific understanding that invisible organisms caused disease. Without this knowledge, sanitation improvements seemed unnecessary, expensive projects with no clear benefit. Second, waste disposal was seen as an individual responsibility, not a collective one. Each household managed its own filth, and when that failed, the streets absorbed the consequences. The idea of a city-wide sanitation system funded by taxes and maintained by public workers didn't exist. It would take centuries, plagues, and revolutions in scientific thinking before cities truly addressed the waste crisis. The medieval approach to human waste left a legacy visible even today. Modern sewage systems, water treatment plants, and public health regulations all emerged from the failures of medieval sanitation. Every flush toilet, every underground pipe, every health inspection traces back to the centuries when people lived in filth and died from it. We inherited not just the solutions but the understanding that waste management is a public responsibility, that disease spreads through contamination, that cities cannot function without infrastructure. Medieval people survived their own waste through sheer endurance, through gong farmers willing to risk death, through women washing rags in dirty water, through communities accepting that streets would always smell of sewage. They had no choice. We do. Every time we turn on a tap, flush a toilet, or walk down a clean street, we're experiencing a luxury that medieval people couldn't imagine. Their struggle with waste wasn't romantic or quaint. It was brutal, deadly, and desperate. And it reminds us that civilization isn't measured by castles and cathedrals alone, but by the invisible systems that keep us alive. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.